Let's do it, Chevra. Okay, we are entering our final two installments of our summer reading series. As I said a moment ago, if anyone wants to recommend early recommendations for next year's summer reading series, we'll take suggestions. I already have a few ideas myself, but I think it's really these last two segments that really touch on some of the issues that are most germane to what we are dealing with in a contemporary context in terms of discussions of military ethics as it pertains to Israel and the many very grave slanders, misperceptions, misportrayals, sometimes innocent misperceptions among those who are not educated, far more often deliberate distortions of what's happening. This is really most of the hot button issues appear in this last section of the book. For context, we're entering the last section of the book, which is called The Ethics of Fighting in War. So a lot of it so far was about the notion or the formation of military ethics. When is it ethical to go to war, right? Under what circumstances is it ethical to go to war, et cetera, et cetera. Now you're fighting a war. So what are the ethical principles that must guide you, that should guide you? What are some of the misperceptions as to what those ethical principles are, et cetera, et cetera. And there are 6 chapters. We'll probably go through 3 tonight and 3 next week, each of which touches on a pretty central issue in contemporary, in a contemporary context when it comes to contemporary military ethics as it pertains to Charbot Barzal, as it pertains to this current war. So just to outline them briefly, again, it starts with chapter 20, but the 6 issues, as I would identify them, are: the first issue he discusses is what he calls the fourth wall issue, which is not so directly relevant. The question of whether you could lay a full siege or whether you need to leave one side of a city unsurrounded so that non-combatants and innocents can potentially escape through that fourth side. So that's the fourth issue. That's the first issue that he talks about. It is somewhat relevant now with discussion of Philadelphia. Now, the Philadelphia crossing has been a major discussion for those who follow what's going on, follow headlines in Israel. The Philadelphia crossing, which is the corridor that serves as the border between Egypt and Gaza, has been a major point of discussion recently, because it's been playing a major role in the hostage deal negotiations. Israel's ability to stay in the Philadelphia corridor or abandoning the Philadelphia corridor. So this fourth wall issue has come up tangentially, because if Israel does take Philadelphia, that means that Israel does effectively surround Gaza on all sides. People tend to forget that Israel does not surround Gaza on all 4 sides. Gaza has a border with Egypt. Of course, very early in this war, Egypt said no one is coming through. They've let maybe a few dozen people, of course, aside from the terrorists that have gone through the tunnels under Philadelphia until Israel took it. They've let very few people through. No one really cares about that because everybody likes to blame Israel for everything. But that is the reality. With talk of a more permanent Israeli presence in Philadelphia, this has kind of resurfaced a little bit, but I really want to focus on that issue in terms of general principles that emerge from it. That's really what we'll use it to focus on. Number 2 is the question of civilian casualties. How do you deal with the question of civilian casualties when you're engaged in urban warfare? When you're dealing with an enemy that deliberately implants its military infrastructure in the middle of a civilian population? What are the ethical halakhic ramifications of civilian casualties? Number 3, a closely related but distinct question: who is a civilian? We could talk about civilian casualties, but how do you define a civilian when you're dealing with asymmetric urban warfare? It's not such a simple principle to pin down. Number 4, we'll talk about proportionality, what that means and what it does not mean. As Rabbi Brody correctly points out, the word proportionality, again, the misunderstanding of the concept of proportionality is the most common cudgel that's used to hit Israel and say Israel is disproportional, it's not proportional, et cetera, with very little understanding of what proportionality actually means in the military ethical context, and what its ramifications are on the battlefield. So we'll talk about proportionality. Number 5, the question of intent, which is again a critical question that the Western world loves missing. The difference between the intent to deliberately slaughter men, women, and children versus intent to kill terrorist combatants with tragic, lamentable, collateral damage. The Western world loves just putting up figures, loves just putting up numbers. This is how many died on the Palestinian side, this is how many died on the Israeli side. That doesn't take into account intent, which is a very important question as well. And then finally, what Rabbi Brody labels the CNN effect. The fact that now, for the first time, wars are fought in the realm of public opinion, and wars are viewed instantaneously across social media channels, online, on the internet. There's this immediate access to information, and there's access to footage and the brutalities of warfare that didn't exist in previous eras, and uniquely applies to Israel because everyone loves, again, just uniquely hyper-focusing on Israel. So how does that impact things, et cetera? So those are the 6 issues, again, all of which are really quite relevant to the contemporary war in which Israel is engaged. And we'll try to talk about the first 3 of those issues tonight. So let's talk about the 4th wall principle. So there's indeed a comment of Rabbi Nassan that says that when Jews lay siege against the city, they should leave one side open to escape, not necessarily open to reinforcements. You don't need to leave the port side uncovered so that the enemy army can reinforce itself and get weapons and get other soldiers and things like that into the city. But you do need to leave it open so that people can escape. If there are any non-combatant civilians that want to get out of there, you give them an opportunity to escape. The Rambam says that that's midivrei Kabbalah. There's no pasuk that says that you need to do that. You won't find a verse in the Torah that says that you have to. The Rambam suggests that it's some kind of misora. It's transmitted from Moshe Rabbeinu or something like that. That that 4th side needs to be a route of escape. And there are several ethical principles to that. Number 1, it does give non-combatants an opportunity to escape. And number 2, it further puts the burden or the onus or the moral culpability for any non-combatant deaths on the defenders. The attackers can say, we gave them an opportunity to escape. If they either chose not to, or if the defending army didn't let them go, then that's on them, it's not on us. So there is ethical merit to it. And he gives 2 really noteworthy examples where Shlomo Goren took opposite positions on 2 sieges laid by Israel, one which he argued was not tough enough, another which he argued was too tough, that really highlight the issue. So the first he talks about is the siege of Beirut. PLO was rooted in Beirut. The IDF laid siege in the early 80s to the city of Beirut, and Rav Goren argued that there should be a route of escape for non-combatants when they laid siege to Beirut, based on this principle that the 4th side needs to be left open. Others adamantly took him to task for it, because if you leave the 4th side open to non-combatants, who else is going to escape? Terrorists are going to escape. They're going to go somewhere else. They're going to retool. They're going to rearm. And others argue that it was an unwise decision. That was the opinion of Shlomo Goren, and it was adopted by the IDF. The IDF had their own tactical and strategic reasons for doing so, but they indeed left the 4th side open. Second was a siege of Tripoli. Again, the PLO took up their leadership in the city of Tripoli, and there, Rav Goren, and there the IDF was again potentially going to leave a route of escape. But there, Rav Goren argued that they shouldn't have. Why? When it came to the siege of Tripoli, it wasn't the IDF surrounding the city. The IDF was surrounding one side. The other side was surrounded by Palestinian splinter groups. Palestinians are all sorts of different groups, and the PLO was obviously one major group, but there were other terrorist groups. The one thing that unites all of them is that they love killing Jews and they love attacking the state of Israel, but there were other splinter groups who were not letting the PLO escape on the other side. So Rav Goren argued, we're not sieging the city, and if we're not besieging the city, then it doesn't matter if other forces are besieging the city on the other side. We don't have to take those ethical ramifications into account if we are besieging the city. So what really both of these positions come down to, and again, Rabbi Brody points this out, is taking this 4th wall argument as strict principle versus general Eitzah Tova. And this is a very important meta concept in halacha. First, let's talk about this particular example, and then I'll give you 2 other examples where I think it applies. One that's an extreme case that is totally unrelated to military ethics, but I think just highlights the point, and another that is quite pertinent to contemporary affairs, is really the hottest argument in Israel right now. Rav Goren could have been critiqued on both sides. You're saying that, we have to leave an escape route open. If you say that that's mamish a halacha, then okay, you have to leave it open. But if it's just a guidance in terms of what ethical principles are in the context of warfare, then if it's going to be abused by the enemy and terrorists are going to escape, then you don't necessarily need to follow it in that circumstance. And on the flip side, it's not necessarily about the number of amos around the city that you cover. If there happens to be a circumstance where there are non-combatants that can't escape because there are splinter groups surrounding the city on the other side, you may have to offer an escape route. In other words, that both of his positions assume that this is strict halacha versus eitzah. Let me give you examples to highlight the point. Some areas of halacha are very, very strict in terms of their particulars and details. Many areas of halacha are like that. Pretty soon, we're all going to get daled minim. You have to get a lulav. Now, if someone just said, "Oh, I know the spirit of the daled minim. We're supposed to think about how the water provides for the crops, and how that's really important. And on Sukkot, we're judged for water. So you know what? Instead of taking a lulav, I'm going to take an ear of corn and I'm going to shake that in shul because it reminds me of the general concept, reminds me of the general principle." Are you yotzei the mitzvah daled minim? Quite obviously not. There's a mitzvah there. There are particular halakhic details, and your lulav needs to accord with those halakhic details in order to properly fulfill the mitzvah. That's a case where the halacha is very strict and detailed in terms of what it is seeking to achieve. Well, let me give you another example. Shaila I received from a young woman in our shul. Okay, she had a pet, whatever the pet was, doesn't make a difference, and she heard that there is a halacha that you need to feed your pets before you eat yourself. So every morning, before she had breakfast, she would feed her pets. And then she calls me and says, "Rabbi Schreier, my pets, according to the veterinarian, are insanely obese. And I keep feeding them too much food, but I have to feed them every single morning before I have my own breakfast. So what do I do? What do I do halachically with this scenario where my doctor's telling me not to feed them, but the halacha tells me that I have to feed them?" So I explained to her quite obviously in this circumstance, when the Torah tells you feed your pets, before you feed yourself, it doesn't mean feed them to death. It doesn't mean that you need to give them so much food so that they can't walk around anymore and that they have health problems and develop diabetes, whatever the case may be. So stop feeding them. Do what the veterinarian tells you. That the goal is to take care of your pets, not to, again, it's not a matir. It's not that you have to feed them before you're able to eat yourself. That's clearly an example where something is eitzah. Chazal are giving us a general principle for how we should approach other living things, how we should treat them, and the compassion that the Torah expects from Jewish people, but it's not a narrow halacha that dictates this must happen in order for you to eat breakfast in the morning. So the question about this fourth wall that effectively some of the Gedolei Poskim were arguing was, what category does this fit into? Rav Golan was saying, this fourth wall is like your lulav on Sukkot. It needs to fit into those strict halachic categories, and when those categories apply, you need to leave the fourth side open. When they don't apply, you don't need to leave the fourth side open, etc. Others said, no, that's not the right interpretation of this principle. It's not a strict halacha like lulav. It's more like the Tzar Balei Chaim example, where Chazal were giving us guidance on how we should be conducting warfare, but not that this is a very strict halacha. Now, where do you have a somewhat analogous example? And I emphasize now that it is not a perfect analogy, but it is somewhat analogous. You have a somewhat analogous example when it comes to halachic debates over the hostage exchanges. And as I said before, that question is really the hottest issue in Israel today. Now, someone asked me about it last week, if you recall, and I said I didn't want to get into it last week because of just how sensitive it is on the week that we lost 6 of our brothers and sisters. And even now, I think it needs to be addressed with grave sensitivity because it's become such a divisive issue within Israeli society. But within the halachic discussions of it, I think this question does loom large. So, how so? So first of all, let me preface this by saying the debate over a hostage deal, a hostage exchange that is currently going on and is, again, the extraordinarily heated and passionately argued issue in Israeli society. It is very much a multifaceted issue. There are really several components to it beyond just the ethical, halachic, principled question. First, there is what we call a metzius question. There are practical questions. Those who are pushing the deal will argue, pull out of the Philadelphia corridor, and the moment the deal is over, we'll take it back 5 minutes later. It will take us a day. It will take us 2 days. We'll go right back into the Philadelphia corridor. We'll be able to stop all of Hamas's smuggling and rearmaments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those who oppose the deal say it's not so simple. We can't necessarily retake the Philadelphia corridor so simply. Even if we could do it militarily, there's going to be immense diplomatic pressure, international pressure not to do it. And it's not so simple to just assume that once we give it up, we'll be able to immediately take it back. Now, that's a military question. That's a military, geopolitical, diplomatic question, right? That's not really an ethical question. It's a question of, will it be simple for us to retake Philadelphia or will it not? That has major ramifications for what your perspective is going to be for this potential deal and whether Israeli forces should indeed withdraw from this corridor that has been a lifeline to Hamas. Another major issue, like all issues in Israeli politics today, is the questions of personalities and trust. Bibi Netanyahu says, this is what we need to do. but there's a major portion of the Israeli populace that doesn't trust Bibi Netanyahu. And then the Ramatkal, the generals, the heads of the government say something else different from Bibi. They say, this is what we need to do. But there's a massive section of Israeli society that doesn't trust the generals anymore after October 7th. They were the same people who were in charge of the army on October 7th. So a lot of it is based on a trust deficit. In other words, aside from the issues themselves, a lot of it is debate over the personalities that are involved. So those issues are obviously not the issues that pertain to halacha. But there is a question of principles as well. One question is a question of prioritizing the war goals. Israel started with two war goals: to destroy Hamas and disable it from ever attacking Israel again, like it did on October 7th. And the second war goal was to bring home the hostages. Which of those two ranks as number one? Which of those two is the most important goal? Excruciating question to answer. And it feeds directly, in a certain sense, into question number two, which is how do we approach these hostage issues in general? And here there are two arguments that really kind of, that are batted back and forth regarding how to approach this kind of issue. You know, again, last week, we were talking about individual versus national. And I said, those who are proposing this hostage deal are not arguing that the needs of those individuals transcend the national needs of Israel. They argue that the deal is a national need for Israel. Why is it? Why is it not? What are the arguments back and forth? So the simple argument against these deals is, look at where they lead. Look at where they lead. You could draw a direct line between the Shalit deal and October 7th. Many of the people that were released, Israel released over 1,000, prisoners, including terrorists with blood on their hands, for one Israeli soldier, in a remarkable expression of just how far we're willing to go for every single chayal, every single Jewish life. But tragically, it led directly to what happened on October 7th. In terms of the personalities, Yehia Sinwar famously was one of the people that was released in the Shalit deal, and now he's the formal head of Hamas. He's certainly the mastermind of October 7th. And B, in terms of informing their tactics, you see that one person is going to get you 1,000 soldiers, then what's your strategy going to be? Let's take more captives. This is great. There's a huge payoff here. Let's continue to do this. And that's exactly what happened. When Yehia Sinwar was in Israeli prison, he made a point of studying Israeli culture and Israeli society. He realized the love that Israel has for every Jew and the lengths they're willing to go to for every single hostage. And in his twisted, diabolical, sick, evil mind, he found, I'm going to come up with a way to twist this against them, use it against them as a military tactic, as a strategy to fight them. So some would say we just need to stop doing these deals. It's painful, it's excruciating, but if you want to stop it, you can't save the current hostages at the expense of hostages that are just going to be taken down the road, because you keep buying into this strategy, and others are going to keep seeking more hostages because they know that they're going to get a high payoff for having them. So how do you discourage them? A, you utterly destroy the people that take Israeli hostages. You let them know there's going to be a massive, massive price. And B, you don't make these lopsided deals. And for a long time, Israel's argument was, if you want a good deal, we need to pulverize Hamas. That's the only way that they're going to come to the negotiating table, and that has proven to be true. But we may be reaching a point where we can't just rely on that anymore. And that is the argument against. Don't keep doing deals that are just going to lead to more hostage taking, etc. What's the counter argument? The counter argument is that these deals are very much needed for the basic morale of the Israeli people. Israel, Tzahal, is a people's army. Every single mother in the Jewish state is asked to send her sons to the front lines. And part of the social contract, if you will, that's a term that's frequently thrown around, between the government and the people is, you send us your finest, you send us your boys, you send us your dearest, and we are going to fight like hell and do everything we can to bring every single one of them home. That's kind of like the agreement, the unstated agreement between the Israeli people and the Israeli government. And that idea has a lot of currency in Israel. There's a lot of currency in Israel. And it's one of the things that I've kind of been taken by and surprised by. I'll be very personal. If you ask me which of those two arguments makes more sense to me, personally, the first one, I will confess, makes more sense to me than the second. You keep doing these deals, you're just going to encourage further hostage taking. And again, like I said, it's tragic, it's painful, it's excruciating, but you're saving current lives at the expense of future lives. That's what you're doing. And to me, that argument is the one that's more compelling. But I obviously qualify that by saying I am not Israeli. I am not Israeli. I never served. As of now, as things stand right now, I'm not getting ready to send my 9-year-old to the front lines, when he graduates from high school. That's not, if he chooses to, then kol hakavod, but it's not an expectation at this point. So I have been taken by how much that social contract really holds sway for very large portions of Israeli society. And it's very important to them, like really important to them. And again, as much as I can't claim to fully understand it, because I would never disparage it. I think it would be rather audacious in me, as a non-Israeli who hasn't had kids on the front lines, to disparage that argument and say, oh, it's foolish, it's stupid, it doesn't make sense. Clearly, for major segments of Israeli society, that argument is very, very powerful and very, very compelling. And it's a key part of the morale that enables this country to send all of their finest boys to the front lines, and readies them to send their children to war. So that's kind of the argument that's raging in Israeli society right now. So why did I mention all of this? There's a remarkable tshuva of Rabbi Weiss on the topic. He wrote a tshuva on it, and it's a tshuva that I plan on giving a full-length shir on at some point. It's worthy of a full-length shir. But he goes through the halachic analysis on this issue. And if you look at the halachos, many of the halachos favor the argument that I was, I guess, favoring. Perhaps my view is itself colored by the halacha, which says that if there are exorbitant prices asked for hostages, you don't make a deal, for the simple reason that it is going to encourage that activity further, right? If you look at a lot of the halachic sources, the Gemara and Gittin, et cetera, there are many sources that indicate you don't make lopsided deals for precisely the arguments we were discussing, because it is just going to lead to further hostage taking and further lopsided deals. So that's like where a lot of his analysis goes. But he qualifies at the end. But he says the laws of milchama are different than the laws of individuals. The Gemara in Gittin was not talking about a case where you have a country prosecuting a war. It was talking about a case where you had a community from whom someone was taken captive, and they were dealing with this captive issue, this ransom issue, on a communal level, or perhaps on a family individual level, but never on a national level. And Rav Asher says, he points to several sources that indicate that the halachos, and I was pointing to this past Shabbos, I was talking about some sources from Rav Kook and Chinuch that point to this idea. The laws that govern these national equations don't always abide perfectly by the calculations that exist for individuals. It could be different. And therefore, he says at the end, he's not coming to a psak halacha on the issue. He's refusing to paskin, because he says, look, here's the calculus when it comes to individuals, but I don't think it's the same when it comes to, a national war effort. And again, he doesn't articulate everything I was saying about the social contract and the morale. He does actually have one line that talks about the morale of the people. He mentions it in passing, he doesn't talk about it extensively, but he says he's not going to paskin this issue for that very reason. So is that the same thing that I'm talking about the report? Not exactly. You have a similar case where one can easily look at the sources and say, psak halacha is X, can't make the deal. That's it. But Rav Asher, as one of the Gedolei poskim, can say that, but then also note that when it comes to a nation prosecuting a war effort, it's not necessarily so clear cut, and there is potentially room for flexibility in the halacha in terms of different scenarios and different occasions. So
he's saying halacha is not what determines the decision, and that's why he won't be posting.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I want to be clear. He's not saying that halacha shouldn't determine the decision. Halacha is always our ethical guide. What he is saying is that the halacha itself is not so clear in this case.
Not so clear, but he's leaving it without a psak.
For that reason, in other words, he's saying, I can't paskin clearly. It's a very honest position from a posek. He is saying, based on the sources, I can tell you what the halacha would be in an individual scenario. But he's saying in the case of a national issue where it's a milchemes mitzvah and it's a government seeking how to best prosecute a war, he's saying, based on the halachic sources, I cannot issue a definitive psak in one direction or the other. So he's not saying, oh, the halacha shouldn't guide us on this. It certainly should. But he's saying it's very difficult to arrive at a definitive psak, given that this is a national issue, distinct from the narrower discussions that exist in the Gemara.
But if someone wants to be guided by halacha and they go to a posek and the posek says, I cannot give a psak, then they can't be guided by the halacha to make a decision.
Right. Again, I hear what you're saying. And my hunch is if the Israeli government came to Rav Asher and said, we want a consultation and we want to know which approach to take, and we're seeking your guidance on this.
He would be forced.
Exactly, correct. And in that instance, the posek, based on their understanding of the various factors and their Torah halachic intuition, would make a decision. But in terms of the abstract discussion and like writing a tshuva, yeah, saying it's not the halachic record. The halachic record isn't definitively clear, right? Exactly.
Many soldiers go to war, telling their parents that they would not want to be traded or something like that.
Again, we've seen cases like that. The cases where they write a final tzava, they write a saying that if I'm taken hostage, don't make a trade. 100%. Again, it's not all for sure, but it's also clear that in major segments of Israeli society, that social contract is sacred. And again, it's not people who are. I can't emphasize this enough. And again, if you guys know me, you'll know that this is something that I always emphasize. We should not fall into the trap, which is always tempting and particularly tempting in contemporary society, to dismiss the other side as either unpatriotic, if you're or naively pacifistic on the one hand, or on the other hand, fascists and militaristic and warmongering, etc. Like it's so tempting to use those slogans, and in contemporary politics, that's the currency of contemporary politics. Of course, you use those slogans. In the context of a heart-wrenching debate like this one, we really should not fall prey to those kinds of slanders. I really believe that the overwhelming majority of people involved in this debate, on one side, want what's best for the state of Israel, and on the other side, want what's best for the state of Israel. This is really an issue where, again, and I'm open where my sympathies lie. And again, I'm open with you about which side I find more compelling. But I think it's very dangerous, certainly on an issue like this one, if we fall prey to thinking that one side is not loyal or anything like that. I don't think that's the case in this instance. So it is remarkably heroic when we see those tzavaos and things like that self-sacrifice to say, if I'm taken, I don't want the country, security compromised for these things. We saw it in the case of some of the hostage families. Some of the hostage families it's certainly not the mainstream view of the hostage families, but I spoke with, when I was in Israel, we spoke with Eliyahu Libman, whose son we learned fell on October 7th, but was believed to be held in captivity. And he said, I don't want my son being brought home at the expense of future Israeli lives and compromising the security of the state of Israel. I saw it in Rabbi Peretz, whose son Daniel also fell on October 7th, killing many terrorists and saving many, many, many Jewish lives. They thought he was in captivity too. And Rabbi Doron is very different personality-wise from Eliyahu Libman, in many ways. But he too was not. He said, "I'm deeply conflicted. As a father, I'll do anything in the world to bring my son home. But as a loyal citizen of this country, as a neighbor, as a friend, how am I supposed to look my neighbor in the eye and say, I'm willing to potentially sacrifice your son, to bring my own home?" Was the way he put it. If it is true that this deal will lead to more hostage taking in the future and will compromise Israel's security, he said, how can I look my friends in the eye and say I'm willing to put your son at risk in order to prioritize my own? It takes remarkable self-sacrifice and heroism to say that, but yeah, there are people who do. So it's really an excruciating, very painful issue that has really the flames have really been elevated over the course of the last few weeks. But I think it's important to understand the sides and the positions and some of the issues, and also important to understand how the halacha weighs in and the limitations of how much the halacha can weigh in, at least according to Rav Asher, in a scenario like this. So that is number one. So two other issues. We'll try to move through them quickly because I do want to get to 10:01 Marib in case anyone else. I'm interested in davening there in case anyone else is as well. Number one, civilian casualties. So let's move through this quickly. Traditionally, the question of civilian casualties was quite simple. Limit them as much as possible. Pretty simple proposition. And of course, in principle, that still, of course, is the goal. You don't want to excessively engage in civilian casualties. You want to limit civilian casualties. Of course, in urban warfare, it is much more difficult because in asymmetric urban warfare, terrorist groups, and it's not just Hamas, although they've kind of elevated it perhaps beyond anyone in human history with their whole tunnel network below Gaza. There's a great dual strategy when you employ human shields. It's evil, it's cynical, it's horrific, but you've done yourself two tovos. You've gained two advantages. Number one, you've protected your own terrorists, assuming that you have a moral enemy who does not want civilian casualties. You've added an extra layer of protection for your terrorist forces because now the enemy is going to be hesitant to hit them in instances when they have opportunities because they're going to be trying to avoid collateral damage and civilian casualties. So number one, you've kept your soldiers alive in some instances. And number two, when the civilians die, you've also scored a victory. Why? Certainly when it comes to Hamas, part of their strategy, and frankly the most effective part of their strategy, is the diplomatic and international pressure that's placed on Israel when there are civilian casualties. Hamas has not been particularly successful on the battlefield. Not at all, frankly. Again, the estimates of the US, the estimates of even Israeli military experts, was that the casualties on Israel's side would be tenfold what they are. Each one is a tragedy. But the expectation was that it would be far, far worse. Hamas has largely failed on the military side, despite the fact they've spent 20 years turning all of Gaza into a fortress and a booby trap. They failed on that front. They've had remarkable success on college campuses. There they've had, again, astonishing. I think they've been astonished by how successful they've been on college campuses, where now it's like in vogue to be openly pro-Hamas on many of America's college campuses. They've had great success in the streets of Teaneck. They've had great success in the streets of New York City. So that's where it's been most successful. Ironically, in the human shield strategy, the ideal l'chatchila result for them is that the terrorists stay alive and the civilians die. They don't want the civilians to stay alive. They're more interested in sacrificing them as martyrs, and they're quite open about it. They're not really subtle. They're quite open about it because that is part of their military strategy to wage diplomatic war, even as they're engaged in military struggle as well. So that makes the question of civilian casualties much more complicated. In terms of a Jewish standpoint, you have two comments of the Maharal on this that are really central to the debate. The one that's quoted most commonly is a comment of the Maharal, and I mentioned this already back on Shavuos. The Maharal on Shechem. Shimon and Levi, Shechem, take a Jewish woman captive. There's sexual violence, she's raped, and they take her captive. Dinah, sister of Shimon and Levi. So what do Shimon and Levi do? They annihilate the city of Shechem entirely. And they are rebuked by Yaakov Avinu for doing so. Now, I will assume, and I think this is the traditional assumption, is that Shimon and Levi were wrong. Yaakov Avinu rebuked them, and the assumption he rebukes them again on his deathbed. If he rebukes them, I think standard approach of most commentators is that they were wrong. There have been attempts to say now that Yaakov Avinu was wrong, but I don't think that's the traditional approach. At the same time, I don't think it is conceivable to say that Shimon and Levi were mass murderers. However they were wrong, however they messed up, whether it be moral, whether it be strategic, they messed up somehow. It is inconceivable to say that two of the Shvatim, who we deem to be among the most righteous tzaddikim in all of Jewish history, it is inconceivable to say that they were, they were actually mass murderers. That's impossible. So the question becomes, what justified the annihilation of the city of Shechem, even if there was some miscalculation on their part in terms of, again, either the moral or strategic calculus? And there are different approaches there. Some suggest that they went to rescue Dinah and the city went to war against them. There's some people who suggest that. There are some, let me just get to the Maharal. Yeah. The Maharal suggests, well, go ahead, actually, ask first, yeah.
Yaakov's rationale for yelling at them for doing the massacre of Shechem was only that there would be repercussions, or else would hit them back. It wasn't that they were wrong.
So it could be, it could not be. Again, it's a debate among our Mepharshim. You could be 100% correct. It could have been that it was a strategic error, not a moral error. Could have been that it was morally justified. And even those who would argue that it's a moral error, my point is, whatever the moral miscalculation was, they're not mass murderers. That's inconceivable. So Correct. If it was a strategic error, then it was a strategic error. That's what Yaakov Avinu was rebuking them for. Of course, a strategic error can turn into a moral error if you jeopardize the safety of the Jewish people. Then the moral miscalculation is not in terms of the casualties on Shechem's side. The moral miscalculation is the potential casualties on the Bnei Israel side, right? But whatever it is, my point is, whatever they did wrong, they're not mass murderers. So, and the question is, why not? So the Maharal has a comment where he argues that war, by its very nature, is a collective affair. It's a war of two nations against each other, of the Bnei Israel against the Bnei Shechem. And once it is a collective affair, then Shimon and Levi were justified with going to war against the entire city. That is the comment of the Maharal. One of the most important and hotly debated sources on this issue of civilian casualties and Jewish military ethics in general. Now, some take that Maharal very, very far to argue that there is no such thing as civilian immunity in the context of Jewish warfare. I think that is a distortion of what the Maharal is saying. And Rabbi Brody very much effectively argues that. He notes that there's another Maharal that talks about Yaakov's battle with Esau. And Rashi, already commenting on Yaakov, says he was afraid. He was afraid for his own life. And he was also afraid that he would have to take wives. Maharal says, Esau is attacking him. He has 400 men. Why was he afraid that he would have to take wives? Maharal says Yaakov Avinu was afraid that some of the men with Esau were forced by Esau to engage in combat, and he was nervous that he would have to take one of their wives, and they didn't deserve to die, etc., etc., etc. So the Maharal is already telling you that there are instances where there is some moral calculus when it comes to this. But it is an important statement in noting that war is indeed a collective affair. Obviously, if it were easy to just target terrorists and not have any collateral damage, everybody would do so. But given the reality that you can't, war is indeed a collective affair. And here, international law has failed miserably. I'm fond of a quote that he has here on page 257, where just again, the international community has so dramatically failed in terms of these standards. So he's talking about roof knocking, which is a tactic that Israel will use, where in order to warn civilians that there's an impending attack, they'll send SMS messages, they'll send text messages, they'll make phone calls, they'll drop leaflets, and then as like the final act, they will drop a dud. They'll drop an empty missile that doesn't blow up the building, but certainly makes a loud bang and does some local damage to let people know to evacuate the building. And he notes there are some people who critique that because you're enabling terrorists to escape. When you make that warning, that gives the terrorists who are in the building an opportunity to escape. And some people critique it on that front. But more remarkable are others who critique it on the other front. What they say is, there could still be civilians in the building who couldn't make it out. Maybe they were prevented by the terrorists from making it out. So you still can't do it. Even if you drop the warning, you still can't do it. If it's a civilian building, you can't hit the target. Now that is all a fancy way of saying you cannot defend yourself. That's all it's saying. It is saying is when faced with asymmetric warfare, you must sit back, let them shoot at you, and do nothing. That's really what it amounts to. That's effectively what it becomes. What it is effectively saying is Hamas, and again, and other terrorist organizations, not just Hamas, but Hamas, in their sadistic genius, have come up with a way where they can ethically shoot at you from within civilian infrastructure, and you can't shoot back. It just makes a mockery of the entire system. And it's important to call that out because it is posed as a matter of ethics. We are so ethical that we will never allow you to target civilian infrastructure. But there are so many layers of unethical conduct and injustice that is built into that. Again, I'm not saying it's deliberately intended this way in all cases. In some cases, it certainly is. But there's so much injustice built into that it's an ethical farce. First, of course, most obviously, it's unjust to those who are being attacked by terrorists. Again, what you are telling me is Hamas can slaughter men, women, and children, and then go into civilian buildings, fire at me from civilian buildings, fire rockets, fire RPGs, fire sniper rifles, and I can't fight back. And that is the ethical thing to do. Allow my people to be the targets of all of this fire and not shoot back. That is what's ethical. Again, it's farcical to even, once you just spell it out, the entire notion is farcical. So it's unjust to those attacked by terrorists. It is unjust to the civilians that this ethical code is ostensibly trying to protect. Why is it unethical to civilians? Because it just encourages these tactics. What you're effectively saying is, Hamas, Yashikoyach, this is a really good tactic. This is a really good strategy. Continue to use this because it works, right? And that is why they do it, because indeed there are so many who just buy it hook, line, and sinker, who really just take the bait so readily. That's what encourages this tactic. So you're also not helping the civilians that you're ostensibly trying to protect, because you're ultimately just encouraging people to put civilians in harm's way, because you're saying, oh, Yashkaya, this is an effective military strategy. And ultimately, I've argued, and I continue to argue, it will lead to the collapse of the entire notion of international military law. And this is a point that I'm certainly not the first to make, but many have made it, but it is a critical point. That international military law is as much about what you can do as it is about what you cannot do. If it were just about what you cannot do, then the Geneva Protocol would be very simple. It would be 3 words: no more war. Shkaya, we created peace in our time. We created a rule that says no more war. So why do they have all these rules? Why do they need all these buttons? The whole premise of this is that wars are going to happen. And sometimes wars need to happen. There are just wars. Human conflict is tragically a part of the human condition. It has been for as long as human society has existed. There are going to be wars. Here is how we can do it in a way that will enable you to achieve your military goals, but also avoid the horrific excesses of the mustard gas that we saw in the trenches of World War I. That is the goal of international military law. When it just becomes what you cannot do, it ceases to be useful. When you tell me, oh, you're attacked, and here are all the things you can't do, and I have no approach for you for what you can do. You just need to sit back and, can take the attack, and you can't defend yourself in any of these ways. That is useless. That is just as effective as saying no more war. It's a nice ideal. It's a nice slogan. It's a nice something that we all aspire for. And that will be the reality. But it's not meaningful in any way. I remember someone saying, after one of the many condemnations from Secretary Gutierrez against Israel, saying Israel can't do this because there are too many civilian casualties. Israel can't do this. Said, Mr. Secretary, please tell us what Israel can do. In your next condemnation, just tell us Israel can't do this. Just tell us what Israel can do also. And of course, again, he'd never be able to, because from his standpoint, Israel can't do anything. But when you've done that, you've made international military law meaningless, useless, pointless. The whole point is to tell you how to properly conduct a war while avoiding the excesses of war, not just saying what you can't do, because that renders it entirely meaningless. And there are really examples abound of this in the context of Israel's wars. We won't go through all of them. And again, I said we get through 3 chapters. We only got through 2. We'll have to get through 4 chapters next week. But the most egregious in my mind was the rescue operation of the hostages. Was the rescue of Noah Argamani, and there were 4 hostages that were rescued that day. And first of all, again, and there were civilian casualties along the way. So first of all, the civilian casualties were, of course, as always, coming from Hamas's health ministry. The number was made up within, the number came out within minutes of the attack. There was already this number of 250, 300 casualties. How they managed to count all the bodies in minutes. Again, clearly they have an amazing health ministry that's able to tabulate those figures so quickly. But even if you grant the premise, even if you grant what they're saying, people said, oh, there were so many civilian casualties. People were asking Israeli generals, did you give them a warning before you went to rescue the hostages? They were like, oh, we've issued a warning for this secret operation to bring our hostages home, right? It just shows what a farce it is. And effectively what the world was telling Israel is, you can't rescue your hostages. You need to let them languish in captivity, and that's moral, and that's the ethical thing to do. And it just exposes what a farce it is. As usual, the halacha has a much more complex, sophisticated, nuanced, and moral perspective. Ultimately, all morality stems from halacha, and this question of civilian casualties is a complicated one. We do not try, chas v'shalom, to pursue civilian casualties. We discussed in earlier segments of this series, but we also recognize that they are a reality of war, particularly when you're dealing with asymmetric urban warfare, and that unfortunately, when you need to carry out certain military aims, there is collateral damage that unfortunately, lamentably, comes with it. So that is our topic for tonight. Next week, we'll talk about the border. What is the line between civilians and combatants, proportionality, intent, the CNN effect. And we will bring our series to a close. I wish everyone a wonderful evening. I'm going to run up to catch Myers.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone.